Welcome to the Clayton Equity Commission meeting. Tonight, we're going to have a couple parts of our agenda that are learning sessions, and then we'll do committee updates. So I'm hoping that David or Andrea will introduce our guests for us.
All right, great. We do have one business item on there, which is approval of the minutes on the agenda before we get to the speakers. Did you want to do that really quick?
Yes, sorry.
That's okay.
Wasn't looking at my agenda. Can I get a motion to approve our minutes from our last meeting?
So moved.
Can I get a second?
Second.
Thank you. Let's put it to a vote. All those in favor, please say yes.
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 Any opposed? Okay, very good.
Okay. So tonight, as the chair had stated, we have two guest speakers we're really excited about. Really early on in this process, we had facilitated sessions, and then we had talked about having a dedicated meeting to really history and trying to build that common foundation, that common base of knowledge about our history. And so the George Floyd incident occurred, and a lot of the national focus and the local focus shifted at that point towards law enforcement, and we really made that pivot along with the country and started to really go in depth on law enforcement. So we spent, as you know, quite a bit of time going over that and really just jumped right in. This month, we're really taking this opportunity. We've gone really deep into law enforcement. We've discussed communications a lot, and it's really a good place for us to go back and get caught up on the history and on that context. So we have two great speakers with us tonight. The first one will be Terry Jones. Terry Jones was a longtime UMSL professor, now retired, still extremely involved in teaching and assisting in these types of things, really whenever he can. He was one of my professors as I went through the graduate program at UMSL, so I'm very happy to have him here. And he's going to be talking really with more of a regional context. And then we have Donna Rogers-Beard, a retired Clayton school teacher, who will be our second speaker, and she's an expert on Clayton history and certainly the Black history here in Clayton. So excited to hear from both of our speakers, and we're going to let Terry Jones go first. So Dr. Jones will kick this off. And as far as the speakers are concerned, they're going to go for maybe 20 to 30 minutes. We'll have questions as well for our speakers if those come up at the end of their talks. And I really look forward to the conversation, the discussion, and the presentations from our speakers. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Jones to lead off.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be with you all and to see many familiar faces as I look at my computer screen via Zoom. Racial inequities are pervasive in the United States, but especially so in the St. Louis metropolitan area. And they inhabit all phases of our lives. I'm only going to concentrate on one, the freedom people have or do not have to choose where they live. I'm concentrating on that because it's important in and of itself, because where we live determines so much other aspects of opportunities in life. It's all about location, location, location. And also because it's the feature of the dimensions of our lives that where most power is possessed by municipal governments, because a lot of it has to do with zoning and eminent domain, which are, as you are aware, one of the places where cities have a lot to say about what does and does not happen. Let's start with the numbers. And the numbers are the St. Louis area is one of the most segregated residentially in the United States. Along with Cleveland and Detroit, Milwaukee, and Chicago, we concentrate the top 5 or 6 in the United States, no matter how you measure it. And since our school districts are based by and large on neighborhood-based enrollments, that means we also have some of the most segregated public education in the United States among the top 50 metropolitan areas. Well, why is that? Well, let me briefly tell the story, how it came about. underlining at the start that the story emphasizes public policy, things that we have done collectively through the society. African Americans became a noticeable share of the population in the St. Louis City and St. Louis County by the late 19th century. There were about 20,000 of almost, but not quite a million. But it became much larger in the first 15 years or so of the 20th century. So by the mid-19 teens, roughly 60,000 African Americans lived in the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County, most of them in the city of St. Louis. That concerned the real estate industry. They thought that it was going to have a detrimental effect, a severe detrimental effect on housing values in the area. So they decided to do something about it. And what they decided to do was to champion an ordinance, a petition, an initiative petition, to do a new zoning plan, which would be the first zoning plan actually, that would say where people could live by race. And it would make as a public policy goal in the city of St. Louis, having all neighborhoods be either all white or all black. And it set aside just 2 neighborhoods of any size, geographic size, for African Americans. One, Mill Creek Valley, which extended from roughly Grand on the west to 20th Street on the east, from Delmar on the north to what were then the railroad tracks, now I-64 on the south. And then a smaller area in northwest city of St. Louis called the Ville neighborhood, which at that point was largely, but not completely white, but was having an increasing number of middle class and slightly less than middle class in terms of economic status, African Americans. That passed overwhelmingly in 1916, but a similar ordinance in 1917 was declared, that was passed in Louisville, Kentucky by its legislature, not by its people, was declared unconstitutional. So it was not able to go into practice as law, as a zoning map. But the real estate interest and the citizenry more as a whole, but particularly championed by the real estate interests, decided to use another device, a restrictive covenant, to try to accomplish the same policy objective by different means. And what they did was to take the 2 areas, but especially the Ville neighborhood, which was the more attractive one from a residential standpoint. The Mill Creek Valley was the lower class area, tenement housing, a very vibrant neighborhood among African Americans, but it was already 100% or close to that African American. So the Ville neighborhood, they went to the neighborhoods encircling that area, trying to turn it into a black island in a white sea by having the homeowners around the Ville neighborhood, but not in it, put a covenant on their deed of trust that they would not sell or transfer their property to a person of color, to an African American. They were very successful. So by the late 19-teens, they had achieved their objective, and restrictive covenants were not only becoming common with there, but they also, over the next 40 years, became common, or no, next 30 years, in the rest of the city of St. Louis and the inner suburbs of St. Louis County, including the city of Clayton. So that became the map for where African Americans could live. Well, you might say, well, that was a private decision for individuals to add that covenant to their deed of trust. And it was. But if somebody violated that covenant, what's going to happen? It's going to go to court. Now it becomes an issue of whether or not it's a public policy, because if the courts enforce it under the cloak of law, both the Missouri courts as well as the federal courts, then it becomes de facto and de jure public policy. And the courts did. So from the late 19-teens until the practice was declared unconstitutional in the Shelley v. Kramer case in 1948, for 30 plus years, we had segregated housing in the city of St. Louis, which is where most African Americans lived, that was enforced by the courts and was effectively in doing that. So African Americans essentially only had 2 choices of where they lived during that period if they were going to live in the city of St. Louis. the Ville neighborhood, or the Mill Creek Valley area. There were also small enclaves of African Americans in St. Louis County: Robertson, Kinloch, Elmwood Park, Meacham Park, North Webster Groves, Wildwood, the old Slave Road area, and Clayton, which we're going to hear about from Ms. Rogers-Beard in a moment. But those were the only other choices that African Americans possessed. So that was the first half of the 20th century. What happened after 1948? What happened after Shelley v. Kramer? Well, in the city, the real estate board and the then guidelines for FHA loans, which was a device to expand home ownership, conspired, not in a legal sense, but in effect that one that affected policy and determined policy, to set aside a zone where would be the African American area that would have and redlining would be applied to that. And as a result, that area was basically Union on the west, Grand on the east, Natural Bridge on the north, and Delmar on the south. And then along with public housing also in North St. Louis, Cochran, Vaughan, Bluemeyer, and then later Pruitt-Igoe, those were the areas for African Americans. So it was very difficult for African Americans to have the opportunity to occupy any other properties but those in the city of St. Louis, and St. Louis County maintained its enclave only essentially policy. If we then look at the next 20 years, the 20 or 25 years following World War II, we see a phenomenon that we're all very aware of: suburbanization. We are all the children or grandchildren of the suburbanizing era. And suburbanization occurred on a very major scale in St. Louis County. The county's population, for example, in 1950 was 400,000 people. By 1970, it was 1 million people, and it stayed in that area ever since. But let's concentrate just on the numbers for the period between 1950 and 1960, when the county's population went up to 300,000 people from 400 to 700,000. Who were those people by race? And the answer is all but 2,000 of them. In other words, 298,000 of them were whites. So suburbanization in St. Louis County between the end of World War II and the late 1960s was essentially a white-only phenomenon. Well, why was that? Well, until 1968, until the passage of the Housing Act of that year, the last of the civil rights legislation, it was perfectly okay, that is to say, not illegal, for subdivision developers, apartment complex developers to say to African Americans, we don't sell and we don't rent to African Americans. And that was it. And they did. So there was essentially no African American suburbanization until the end of the Housing Act in 1968. What about 1968 to the present? Well, why are we still, even today, one of the most segregated metropolitan areas in the country? Why is the so-called dissimilarity index over 70? It's in the low 70s, when it was actually at 80 when Shelley v. Kramer was decided in 1948. It's only gone down less than 10 points during that period. Why have we maintained those high levels of segregation now that the law is not as much involved? And the answer is a mixture of personal preferences, real estate practices, and search patterns for real estate. Let's start with the preferences. And this, what I'm about to report, applies only to some areas in the United States. It's only been substantiated in those. And indeed is the areas that includes the areas that we've already talked about: Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Chicago, St. Louis, northeastern and midwestern cities. If you do a carefully designed sample survey of both African Americans and whites in those areas about why they choose to live where they live and what their preferences are, here's what happens. When you talk to the whites, and you ask them, what would be your ideal racial division in a neighborhood? Would you like a neighborhood that is 100% white, 90% white, going all the way down to 10% white? The average, the modal response, the one you hear most often from whites, is 90%. The ideal neighborhood for a white is 90% white, 10% African American. Then if you have an open-ended question, well, why did you pick 10%? The answer is, well, when I grew up in an all-white neighborhood. And that caused me to have to make several adjustments in my adult life to learn much about African Americans that I did not know and I should have learned as a child. I'm less the person for not having had that experience. And I want my children to have that kind of familiarity. So I want African Americans around my neighborhood so that they do have that exposure and experience. Keep those numbers in mind. Now we're going to have the poll for the African Americans. Same question to start. What is your ideal percentage of African Americans in a neighborhood? 100% African American, all the way down to 10% African American. For African Americans, there are three responses that dominate, and those are 50% African American, 40% African American, and 30% African American. Why do those three dominate? Again, with the open-ended question. Well, you get a pretty much a where you've been lately got a response from those individuals. This is a white majority society. Whites are more powerful than African Americans. If I want high quality public services and goods, and that's what location is all about, I'm going to be more likely to achieve that in an area that has a noticeable number, a majority or a slightly more than a majority of whites in that neighborhood. But I want to live in a neighborhood that has a sufficient number of African Americans so that I do not feel like I'm the only one or the only one of a few in that neighborhood. Now let's go back to the whites. One more question. We asked the whites, well, at what point would you not seriously consider moving into a neighborhood depending upon the proportion of African Americans living in that neighborhood? Would you move in a neighborhood that was 10% African American? Sure, I already told you that. 20% African American? Probably. 30% African American? Maybe. 40% African American? Maybe not. And then even less of an affirmative response. Now let's put all of those numbers together. Let's take a house that opens up in a neighborhood, not because of white flight. Let's keep that off the table just for the moment. But because somebody dies or somebody moves. And let's assume that's in a neighborhood that's 25% African American, 75% white. For an African American, that 25% is in the sweet spot, getting close to the sweet spot. An African American is more likely to be very interested in that property and therefore pay a higher price for that property than is a white, because the property is moving out and away from the desired proportions by whites. So that causes a higher level of African American demand, a lower level of white demand, and the neighborhood starts to tip. And typically over a 10 to 20 year period, tip it does. And that's been the predominant experience, not simply in St. Louis County and other parts of the St. Louis metropolitan region, but throughout the kinds of metropolitan areas that we've already limited this to, ones in the Midwest and the Northeast. Then that is aided and abetted by two other matters. One is search patterns. What's going to happen when you're going to make a major decision about where you're going to live? And what's going to happen is you're going to talk to your other people in your extended family. You're going to talk to your friends. If there's mostly people of the same race, they're going to say to you, well, I live X, and I think I like X. Why don't you come out and look at X? That tends to perpetuate any problems that any situation, any pattern that history has already created. The other is real estate preferences. Steering does exist. Steering, whether it's sincerely based or whether it's based on racial discrimination. Because a real estate agent is more likely to say, and the test would show that this happens, to an African-American couple, this identical in all respects to a white couple, let's make them upper middle class. Well, you're probably like, if you're living, seeking a place in the North St. Louis, in the St. Louis area, somewhere in North St. Louis County, outer North St. Louis County, you'll find a lot of people like you there. And therefore you're going to be more comfortable there. Therefore, let me show you some houses there. And the same response then would be made to the white couple, the white household, on where they would feel more comfortable, or the real estate agent's perception of that. All of those things being put together, then we continue to have the level of racial segregation that we have. And that also then, to some extent, limits choice, not as much in a direct, overt, by law that we had earlier, but de facto it still results in the same pattern, much of the same patterns. The other aspect of residential choice is being able to stay where it is that you wanted to live. And that story is going to be told by Ms. Rogers Beard, because when you look at neighborhoods that are majority or exclusively African-American, that become valuable for something else, economically more valuable, what happens to the current residents of those neighborhoods? What happened to the people who are living in Mill Creek Valley? What happened to the people that were living in Evans Place in Brentwood? What happened to many of the people living in Meacham Park? What happened to the people living in Elmwood Park? A way is found to demove them, to transfer them, to wipe out their community. And that is the story of what happened in Clayton. So I will, David, do you want to postpone questions until after Ms. Rogers Beard has had an opportunity?
You're still muted, David. Now you appear to be unmuted, but we can't hear you. Not sure what that's about. I think we will post. Yes, now we can hear you.
Go ahead.
What were you thinking?
I was going to say, let's go ahead, and I think he set up the segue really nice into Ms. Rogers Beard's presentation. So let's go ahead and hear from her, and then we'll take questions for both, and we'll go from there.
Great.
Sorry about the mute.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. It did earlier, didn't it? Okay, this was all set up. Okay. So we're going to look at at the Clayton community. And usually I begin my story with the first postmaster of Clayton. Can everyone hear me and everyone see the screen?
Yes, and we even have very helpful captions that appeared. So
yes.
This is wonderful. We have the accessibility.
Okay. So I usually begin with the story of Clayton's first postmaster. And not many people know this, but the first postmaster of Clayton was a man by the name of Richard Hutland, who was appointed in 1896 by William McKinley. Few people know that he was Black. And his is an amazing story, but it's not my focus tonight. Tonight, the focus is the people of African ancestry who lived in Clayton almost since there was a Clayton, and why their presence is so important. So, first of all, August 20th, 2016, Donald Trump was on Fox News, and his message to the Black community was, "Your lives are so miserable, I couldn't possibly make things worse." Trump told Fox News reporter that Blacks in America have no health care, no education, no anything. He described the lives of African Americans as a total catastrophe. And the most recent book, bestseller, Walter Johnson's The Broken Heart of America, focuses on pretty much the victimization of Black people in St. Louis and spends very little time on Black people who either found themselves in the small towns outside of St. Louis after emancipation, or who made the choice to live in the small towns that will become the suburbs of St. Louis County, even before the 20th century, and how they sought to carve out for their families a relatively quiet, safe life and the best education possible for their children. Our lives were not a total catastrophe, even during the era of Jim Crow. This is the Joshua family. While there is evidence in the census and the city directories that there were Black residents in Clayton, I want to focus on this pioneering family. This is Fannie Ellis Joshua. She and her husband built their home at 122 South Hanley. It was at the northeast intersection of Colorado and Hanley Road, 1 block from what will become the Attucks School. Their house was located where the car wash is today, and their backyard was the grounds of what will become the Ritz-Carlton. A little background, Fannie Ellis Joshua was born to the parents Mary Breckenridge Ellis and William Ellis. Her mother had been enslaved by the Breckenridge family of what is now Breckenridge Hills. She and William had at least 10 children, and many of those children will become homeowners in Clayton, in the streets, on the neighborhoods between Colorado Street and Carondelet. This is the 1910 federal census showing Randall Johnson, his family, and 4 children. And we see, first of all, that they own their home. It is mortgage-free. We find that he worked as a porter at the Commission House in downtown St. Louis, and he lives at 212, and this is the way it was spelled back then, Handley Road, 3 years before Clayton is incorporated as a city. Further evidence, we have the Clayton phone exchange from 1922, and we see that in 1920, it's actually 1923, Randall Joshua is one of the few Claytonians to have a phone. His exchange is 83, and I've highlighted the other Black residents in yellow who also have phones. The next slide is of their daughter. This is Ida Joshua. You see that she was born in 1903 at the home on Hanley. She attended Clayton School number 2. The Attucks School was not built until 1923. In 1910, she would have been one of 40 children at that school. Her children will attend Attucks. Her grandchildren will then be part of the first Blacks in the community to attend the integrated Clayton schools. Further evidence we have in the St. Louis County Advocate, November 28th, City Collector Henry Stecker has completed his labor as a census taker of the city of Clayton. Mr. Stecker says there are 1,948 residents within the prescribed boundary limits of the town. Of this number, 137 are colored and 10 are Japanese, the latter being resident waiters at the country club. So this is the school that Ida would have attended. This was the first school established in Clayton, March 5th, 1880. It was a one-room schoolhouse. It was built for $700. It was framed. There were 48 students in the district. 45 students were white and 3 were black. Now, this is interesting because Missouri state law mandated a separate black and white schools since they redid the Constitution in 1875. Now, in 1892, a new school will be built, a 2-story brick, but the black students will remain at this school, which was located on Coleman Avenue until 1923, when Attucks was built. So we have about that time, in 1893, the Watchman, which was the local newspaper, said, Clayton should feel proud of its schools, both white and colored. They started with a one-room frame building with 1 teacher. Now the white school has an elegant modern structure with a principal and 3 teachers. The colored school is also well conducted, and the colored people of the town are as proud of the progress made by their children as it is possible for the white parents to be. Also, 1894, the Watchman says the Clayton Colored School, Miss Mary Williams' teacher, closed last Friday with the usual exercises. Those who witness the examination speak in flattering terms of the progress of the school and the good work of the teacher. To her credit, we must state that the work exhibited is far superior to what we expected and compares well with other good schools in the country. Miss Williams deserves to be well encouraged. So we know that in the beginning, the Clayton School District was known for its excellence. This is the Attucks School, and this is the school that is those pictures, that pictures in every history of Clayton. It was built in 1923 and remained in operation until it was closed in 1954. At its peak, it had about 40 students. A few of them were tuition students from Webster Groves, Ladue, and elsewhere in the county. And it was commended as the best one-teacher school for Negroes in the state. And upon graduation, because it only went to the 8th grade, the Clayton School District paid the tuition for Attucks graduates to attend either Sumner High School in the city or later on Douglas School in Webster. One account of the Attucks School is in a book that was published by the boys and girls of the 7th and 8th grade of Clayton in 1931. And it tells us that there were 35 students and the teachers and where it was located. This is what it would have looked like inside of the building. And here we have in plaid dresses, Ida, the daughters of Ida Joshua. That's Joyce and Evelyn Mckay. And it's probably 1943. This picture is of them at their 8th grade graduation. Note the ribbons. I showed this to a group of 1950, I think 1950, yeah, 1954, 56 graduates. And they said, oh yeah, we had the exact same ribbons at our school. Their brothers, Gerard and Daniel Mckay, are going to be the last of the family to attend the Attucks School. And the Claytonian newspaper will say that there's a new sight in 1954, Negroes and whites in the same school. Brown versus Board of Education. Clayton immediately got right on board and integrated immediately. Daniel Mckay went to the 8th grade and Gerard went to the 3rd grade. Both went to the Maryland School. And even though the Attucks School was considered the best school for children of color in Missouri, Gerard, in an interview with me, said he realized immediately that he had not gotten what his white Clayton counterparts had experienced. The Maryland school was extremely difficult for him, and he had to work very hard to catch up. But he was given tutors and caught up with his classmates quite readily. Richard, his brother, went on to the high school for 1 year until the family in 1957 moved to Los Angeles. There, Gerard said he found himself scholastically well ahead of his classmates. This is the home that their grandparents built. Their father, Julius Mckay, the husband of Ida, was a concrete mixer driver with the Hauser Concrete Company. This is the house on Hanley. The site, what's there now is the Clayton Car Wash. Gerard Mckay remembers playing with his best friend, who was a white neighbor, in the woods east of their home, which is now the site of the Ritz-Carlton. And he said there they were in the woods playing cowboys and Indians. And he had most fond memories of growing up in Clayton. These are the Mckays outside of their home. Gerard Mckay said he remembers such a strong sense of community. And he said he felt a feeling of support, belonging, and protection. We didn't think much about social and political issues, as all the people around us were our friends, family, and community. My older brother and sisters talked about the fact that if ever they did anything wrong in the neighborhood, before they could get home, the word would get to our parents, and they would be ready to give out instantaneous punishment when you arrive. He said it's mostly their Black neighbors were pretty much related to them, either by marriage or by blood. This is inside their home. This is the family at Christmas in 1955. The man playing a board game with them is Leon Curtis. He was the husband of Mattie Joshua Curtis, one of the siblings of Mrs. Ida Mckay, and he too lived in the community. Now, their activities were the activities you would have expected to find, the family around the board games. But this was the ladies of the Saturday Reading Club, which Mrs. Ida Mckay belonged to this group. Many of these women worked outside their homes. They were teachers. Some of them did domestic work. And on the weekend, they gathered in many different social clubs. This picture, it was taken at a Brentwood home and of the Saturday Reading Club. And there was quite a family and social connection between Blacks who lived in Brentwood, Kirkwood, Creve Coeur, Chesterfield, and Webster Groves, and Blacks in Clayton. Now, when it came time for Ida Mckay to host, her meeting is written up in the St. Louis Argus, like all of the social activities in the suburbs. So here we have Ida Mckay was hostess to the members of the Saturday Reading Club and extra guests at her home in Clayton, Missouri. Following dinner, Gladiola Gooden reviewed Private Lives of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Helen Scroggins presented items of current interest. A coronation quiz game was played with prizes going to Hazel Avery, Bessie King, and Augusta Boulding. Their lives were full. This is Evelyn Mckay's wedding. She married a man by the name of Johnson, and this union occurred at Clayton First Baptist Church. Now, this is the Clayton Missionary Baptist Church, which was at 216 South Brentwood. Dixon Terry's book on Clayton, which is considered the primary book on Clayton, talked about the Attucks School, but makes absolutely no mention of this church in his chapter on churches in Clayton. This is one of the first churches built in Clayton. It was built in 1893. The Black residents at the time bought the land from the Davis estate, which is most of what Shaw Park and Brentwood is today. And first they built a frame church and then this church in 1905. It was remodeled in the 1940s and it was sold in 1961. And the reason it was sold was because the community that the Mckays loved had been completely, by that time, rezoned as commercial. Now, fascinating is that there was a solemn ceremony after the final services, October 8th, 1961. At 2:30, a processional left the Clayton Baptist Church forever and relocated and became the Clayton Missionary Baptist Church on North Union in the city of St. Louis. This would have been the minister. Reverend Rhodes served as minister for 55 years. Mrs. Mckay is the lady there at the black hat, the wide brim hat. And this is Dick and Terry's book. This is what it looks like today, that site. This is the site of the Bethesda Barclay house. This is where the Baptist church and the community around it would have sat. But before we go on, I want to tell you a story of a beautiful day that happened in Clayton. In 2006, with the support of then Clayton Superintendent Don Sente, and then Mayor Uschitel, the Black Student Union that I sponsored at Clayton High School was able to place a plaque commemorating the site of the Attucks School. And we hosted a reception at the high school honoring the former residents of Clayton and the alumni of the Attucks School. The reception followed at the high school and they told their stories of growing up in Clayton. There was not a dry eye in the house. Take note of the woman in the lilac suit. Her name is Anna Lee Williams, and she went to the Attucks School. This is her report card from 1945-1946 school year. The story of her family is different from many of the people who were related to the Joshua and Mckay family. This is her graduation diploma, 8th grade. Telling the story of how her father, Theodore Williams, came up from Mississippi in 1936 when Anna was 3. He came up by himself, and he was part of that Black migration. And they're going to settle at 118 South Hanley in a 2-family flat, probably just, I guess, south of the where the car wash is today. They paid a rent of about $15 a month and left Clayton in 1956. So Mrs. Williams said that when her father got off the bus in downtown St. Louis, the first thing he asked, the first person he came across was, where do the rich white people live? He was told to go to Clayton. Go to Olive Street, take the streetcar to Clayton. He got off at Bonham and Central. And walking over to Bonham and Hanley, he saw Black children being aided at the crosswalk by the crossing guard, Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross was also a community member. He and Mr. Ross talked. It was then that Mr. Williams decided this was the best place for his family. They would live in Clayton for 20 years. I asked Miss Turner how she and her neighbors felt when they were bought out. She said it was inevitable. They were surrounded finally by all commercial property and were not surprised when it was rezoned all commercial. She recalls that when Famous Bar came to Clayton in 1948, how excited everyone was, but did not understand that this was really the beginning of their demise. Actually, she was one of the first Black hires at Famous Bar. She worked in the hosiery department as a young woman. There were other stories, and this one I wish I'd known when we had the reception, but I found out later because I certainly would have asked the former residents if they knew about this. This is Eleanor Roosevelt, and she is presenting an award to the renowned contralto Marian Anderson. And all of us, us older people, know that earlier that year, in 1938, the Daughters of the American Revolution had refused Miss Anderson permission to sing in their Constitution Hall. And Miss Roosevelt, a member of the organization, resigned and got permission for Miss Anderson to give her concert from the Lincoln Memorial. The year before that, however, March 18th, 1938, Miss Anderson performed at the Municipal Auditorium and spent time as a house guest of a Clayton family. Now, this puts us in the context, of course, of Jim Crow. She could not stay at any of the hotels in the city, and so she boarded at the home of Mrs. Grant Williams. So here we have a St. Louis Argus article that Miss Marian Anderson was the house guest of Mrs. Grant Williams and daughters on Carondelet during her brief stay in St. Louis. So who was Mrs. Grant Williams? Miss Grant Williams, we find out in the Argus, September 3rd, 1954, carried her obituary. She was the widow of the late Grant H. Williams, and their home, 7723 Carondelet. And we go down, we find out that she is one of the oldest members of the Black Clayton community, and their story is absolutely fascinating also. Her two daughters at the time of her death were 47 and 46. One was a teacher at Sumner and the other was a professor at Stowe, which will later become Harris Stowe University. Other families, one would have been the William Bailey family, and later on the Charles Rollins family. And we have the announcement of their wedding. William Bailey was a custodian at the courthouse, and he's often in the newspaper, in the local newspapers. But what's fascinating is that Clayton had a baseball team. And they had a white baseball team and they had a Black baseball team. And if we'll read this, Bill Bailey's Chocolate Babies, and this was the Bill Bailey's team, he started it, hung it on the Clayton Crows Sunday by a score of 30-11. The game was played on the Clayton grounds, and Clayton's Black 400 turned out in full numbers and rooted for Bailey's Pork Chop Kids. It gets better, folks. Each side made about 150 errors and many hits. Every son of Ham who stepped to the plate knocked the ball all over the lot. They all knew how to bat, but fielded like a bunch of monkeys. It took almost 4 hours to finish the contest, and both nines were white with dust when the last man was retired. The Chocolate Babies wore their cutest possum smiles after the contest and said they were ready for the Bridgeton smokes. So here we have that article. However, all was to change in Clayton, and we know it as civic progress, which it completed around 1959, 1960. However, had been in progress really since the late 1930s. From 1929 to 1944, there was this gradual rezoning of property, residential property in Clayton, especially in this community we're talking about, which is this Carondelet, Old Bonham area. This is what that community looks like today. And I find fascinating a newspaper article, Post-Dispatch, about the end of this period. It's 19, oh my goodness, I can't, okay, yeah, oops. Back. And this is just looking at it highlighted in yellow. It's the words of Roy W. Jordan, who was an investment man who lived in Clayton and was vice chairman of the Clayton Planning Commission. And he says, going down, other cities have had to have urban renewal, Jordan said, but our community encouraged the redevelopment of the central business area through zoning ordinances. The residential section has not been encroached on by the development of the commercial, which in itself is unique. The bedroom population is approximately the same as it was 10 years ago without creating any more areas. And it's a fine residential area. We know better. We know that unfortunately, Black residents did not have a seat at the table, were not part of the process, did not realize to the extent that their community would be eradicated. We know, as James Baldwin says in an interview in 1963, urban renewal to Blacks is Negro removal. So hopefully I can get back to, yeah, so my screen. Okay. So I think it is an important story in understanding this community that whose story is just, it was forgotten. It was forgotten by most of St. Louis. It is not included in the stories of Clayton and even the stories that have been written about suburban Blacks in suburban St. Louis.
I'm looking at where we are with time, and so I just want to transparently check in with Andrew and David. I'm thinking it would be nice to be able to ask our panelists some questions at this time. So I'd like to modify the agenda and pull up our public comment to this time, as well as having a chance for the commission members to ask questions. Does that work?
Yes, that would be fine.
Okay. So we'll take about 10 minutes for questions, and attendees, you have a ability in your interface to raise your hand. That helps us know that you'd like to ask a question. And I'm going to try to keep an eye on both our panelists. If you could just like physically raise your hand so I can see it, I'll begin creating a stack of people ready to ask questions. Donna, did you have a question to start?
No, I'm just letting you know where I am.
Okay. Thanks. I see one hand up amongst our attendees. Kathleen, go ahead.
Thank you, Laura. This is Kathleen Gund. I think the presentations were great. Thank you so much. And I really want to, I initially had a comment, but I also kind of have a question. So I'm applauding the members of the commission for their decision to move on towards housing as they move into as an issue within our community as they go into 2021. And I'm hoping that they will kind of springboard off of the work that's already been done in dismantling the divide. And so my question to both Terry and Donna would be, what do you think Clayton should be focusing on to remove barriers to entry for African Americans?
Donna, you want to go first and then I will chime in?
That is a question I don't think I have a good answer for. I think Clayton missed an incredible opportunity to build on a community that was there, that was vibrant. There would not have been this issue today had it not been their community, their sense of safety, and all the things that they did to aggressively be part of the Clayton community was not taken from them. So, I think that when Terry Jones talked about real estate people and how they help people choose where they want to live, that might be one place. And that is in how people are steered, making sure, as I used to tell the Clayton desegregation students when I would speak to them, I would say, welcome home. That the story of the Black community needs to be out there and touted by current residents. It's a story you need to know, need to share with people. The real estate companies need to know it. Everyone needs to know the story.
If Clayton chooses as a community diversify its population.
Can you take over as host for a moment?
Should I continue or should I wait for Laura here?
Go ahead and continue. Okay. I think she had a child.
If Clayton chooses as a community to diversify it racially, its population, it has to, as it appreciates, as I know it does, you're not going to be able to redo history and redo the landscape. You do have the housing stock that you have. You cannot recreate it. But 50 years ago, I would have had to say, well, there are few, if any, very few, almost no African Americans in the region who could afford to live in Clayton or much of Clayton. That's no longer the case. You could populate a Clayton with many African Americans, and you do, who can afford to live there. But it needs to be an attractive, comfortable place for them. And therefore, that it requires an outreach to reassure them or assure them that not only are they welcome, but that it's an area in which they will feel equal and as well. There was a very interesting article written by Dick Wise about one couple, African-American couple in Clayton, one of that couple is somebody I've served on nonprofit boards with and have a lot of, so in any case, I know. And so their message was, we still don't feel comfortable here. Well, what can you do to make them feel comfortable? I'm not talking about that couple alone, but what can you learn from that experience? It's not unlike the World Trade Center deciding and the community decided through Project Mosaic that we wanted to be more attractive to foreign born. What can we do to be more welcoming? What can Clayton do to be more welcoming?
There's a question in the chat from one of our commission members about, is it possible to calculate the economic loss to the families who were displaced? And I'm just going to piggyback on that. It's my impression, Donna, that you in doing your research, you've connected with quite a few of the families who had made Clayton their home. And I was wondering if you could speak to how many folks you've been able to track down in your research.
Uh, it's hard to give you an exact number. I would say certainly about 10 to 15 families that have been able to follow into St. Louis or California, as it is with the Mckay family. But we also, in response to your question, the value of these homes, it's stated in one of the census will ask the value of the home. So taking that and looking at what would that property be worth in today's dollars, I think would be interesting. I mean, and as Terry Jones said, it's not the same community in that housing stock is gone, but certainly understanding if they were to sell that home, what it was worth at that time, today, what would it be worth? That information's available.
Thank you. It looks to me like I'm not seeing other hands in the chat or amongst our panelists. So I'm just gonna wait a beat for people to collect their final thoughts if they'd like to ask a question of our panelists.
I just wanted, I have a question.
Too. Okay, Ben and Joanne. We'll do Ben and then Joanne.
Go ahead, Joanne.
Oh, you're always gracious, Ben. Thank you. Terry, you said that, if I recall, that it takes 25% African Americans feel comfortable in environments where they're at minimum 25% minority. If I remember
that, yeah, we're in that area. That
yeah, yet
it doesn't go from zero to 100 between 24 and 25.
I know, but yeah, something like that, and yet the white people that you've talked to start feeling uncomfortable at that point.
Correct.
So it's almost like there's this people's needs, I guess what we call them, part of the whole Maslow needs are at odds as well as far as comfort, which is, I had never considered that as being part of the problem. I had considered the price of housing. I had considered a lot of other things, but I think that I really appreciate you bringing that up and talking about that.
Again, it's not my role to tell Clayton what it wants to be or should be. Although as an aside, I participated in one of these sessions with the Clayton City Council and others many years ago, so long ago that Ben wasn't even mayor yet. Hugh Scott at that point was mayor, where I proposed that maybe you should look a little more kindly about Richmond Heights, because while it might not be as attractive to you from your perspective, it was certainly getting wealthier. So with the proviso that it's not my role to give advice, if you chose, you could have the vision of being one of the few suburbs, municipalities in the United States that consciously decided it was going to be, by and large, an upper middle class suburb that was truly racially integrated. And by that, I mean relative to its metropolitan population in the 25 to 30% African American, 70 to 75% white range. If you wanted to be that way, if you wanted to make that a conscious public policy of the city, and that's a goal that you're going to work towards over the next 10 to 20 years, because it would take that amount of time to achieve it as housing became available, as it naturally turned over. You would get a lot of press.
Well, you mentioned Dick Weiss, who is in the audience right now. So I'm sure he would love to write that story. Ben, did you have a final question for us?
Just a comment, as Terry will recall, We tried for several years to bring about a possible merger or partnership with Richmond Heights, and that floundered, but much effort. Do you have any comments on the idea of requiring in future multifamily housing set-asides for minorities?
As a regional policy, I'm all for that and highly applaud it. That doesn't mean, though, and one of the charms and potential pluses of the St. Louis region is that not all of its municipalities need to look alike or should look alike in terms of their style of housing, et cetera. So that's why I stressed one way of structuring a policy goal, not the only way. One way of structuring a policy goal is we're going to stay the way we are in terms of our housing stock. We're just going to have a different mix within it, because there are now enough of population of either race to afford the housing in Clayton.
I'm not sure I completely followed your last point. You're saying that you're tracking us back to focus on becoming the most welcoming and inclusive space that you can, rather than change.
I would not link that with affordability.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
For among those who could afford it.
Okay. I really appreciate that. There's another question in the chat, but I do think we need to hold and move on from here to get to our other business items. Dr. Jones and Donna, do you have what is the appropriate title? I feel like you've done all this research. I feel like you must have earned a PhD in
no, it's not rocket fear.
Accurately.
That's it.
Do you have the ability to stick around? We can reopen up for questions.
I'll be happy to remain as well, but
if we get there. I'd like to turn to old business now. David, can you tell us a little bit about the public comments from our last meeting?
Yes, I can quickly go through those. We had 3 public comments. The first one was Peter Smith was talking about the mission statement and was really just happy that we were going to send out the survey to our residents. We received a similar comment from Lily Raymond. She also recommended that when asking for input from real estate agents about their experience with why clients may not be interested in moving to Clayton, the commission consider the implicit and explicit biases of the agents. So that was really the larger conversation again of being welcoming, which Dr. Jones just talked about as well. And then finally, we had a comment from Steve Burrows, who recommended that the members of the commission or the law enforcement subcommittee of the commission attend the Citizens Police Academy to understand exactly what they're reviewing. So as I had stated at the last meeting, when the Citizens Police Academy comes back around, I'll be sure to send out that information to all members of the commission for anybody that may want to participate in that. And those were the public comments.
In Nikki's absence, is there somebody else who would like to give an update on the mayor's commemorative landscape, or shall we skip it till next time?
I can update. The task force is working on a draft for their evaluation criteria. So we'll have that discussion at our January meeting.
We'll now move to subcommittee updates.
Mark, I had one thing that I think Michelle wanted to convey as well, that when we see that Donna was coming, that they are looking at putting some commemorative something for the neighborhood that was going to be developed into the commercial areas. So that is on.
Your sound's not great, Susan. What I think I made out was that you wanted to communicate that the mayor has made it clear that inside the commemorative landscape work will be looking at the displaced neighborhoods and how to mark that and in a different way. Is that accurate?
That's correct. It's one of their priorities. They're looking at exactly what Donna was presenting today.
Great. We'll now move to the communications subcommittee. Yvonne had asked me for 2 minutes to share the tradition we've started to develop of a reflection moment in every meeting to ground ourselves in the important history that our work is steeped in. And then I'm not clear after that who from the committee would like to give their update.
Great, thank you, Laura. Thanks, everyone. This month, Montgomery, Alabama held a week of events commemorating the Montgomery bus boycott. And we too paused to commemorate this historical event and to honor one who dedicated her life for the rights of others. On December 1st, 1955, 65 years ago, a seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, sat down in the front, the white section of the bus. This woman was asked by a white bus driver to move to the back of the bus, the black section. But she refused and was arrested for disorderly conduct. This was Rosa Parks. Ms. Parks' act of defiance and courage helped end segregation laws in the South. While Ms. Parks sat down for civil rights, let us keep standing up for equity, diversity, and inclusion. On behalf of the CEC and the citizens of Clayton, we give honor to Ms. Rosa Parks. Thank you, and I'll yield to the other communication members.
I can give a quick update for, we fielded our survey on the mission statement for any of the attendees. If you have not noticed in the Clayton newsletter, as the printed and the email newsletter, both have links for you to go on and talk about the updates, including diversity, equity, and inclusion in the mission statement. Andrea said we have 27 responses to date, and it's mostly favorable. So yay for that. And we also talked to Dr. Doherty about including our messaging on suspicious activity, false reporting. And so we will have a message that will go out to the parent community through the school's newsletters. So yay. Anything else, Ben, Yvonne?
Thank you, Chris. I do want to add one thing about the survey. The survey is really an opportunity. It's twofold. Well, it's very short. It doesn't tax the citizens' time. It does allow for us to get information on the mission statement, but also for two-way communication in that we're asking the community to give us feedback on what they think about equity and what they think the CEC should be doing. So again, a very quick, but a very good survey that we hope to glean a lot of information. So please, please, please run it in your newspapers, wherever you can, your social groups, your book groups, please get the word out. Thank you.
And one more way to get the word out is by people on the commission and ex officio just sending out a little message to their friends to please go to the survey. And I just did that with a lot of people, and hopefully we'll get more responses. It's apropos of what we're working on to address the desires and the goals of Terry Jones and Ms. Rogers Beard. Thank you.
Great. If that's all, okay, it looks like people got a copy of the link, and Ben, your wording is very helpful for those of us who want to reach out to our friends as well. Stuart, I understand you'd like 10 minutes for the subcommittee, the law enforcement subcommittee. I think I'm going to have to limit that to closer to 7 minutes.
Well, I was going to allow Ben 3 minutes, so that'll be his minutes. I'm just kidding. So thank you, Laura.
I thought there was only Ben words.
Quiet, please.
So our focus recently has been on the municipal courts. We call that the Muni Court. It's clearly more dry than the discussion we just had on housing, so hopefully you can bear with me. We met a couple of days ago on Zoom, and I think it's important to understand who was in the meeting, including myself and Ben. It also included Suzanne and Joanne from the board. Andrea was also on the Zoom. She helped us out setting it up. And from the city, we had Janet Watson, who's in I forget her title, but she's in finance in Clayton, and also Enrique, who is the court administrator. And it was very educational. We learned a lot. We went over a lot of territory. The Zoom lasted about an hour and a half. So I'm just going to try to summarize some of the highlights. Starting with the beginning, that the municipal courts, and there are about 88 of them in St. Louis County alone. That's where most people interact with the justice system, as it turns out. Typical docket in Clayton is about 300 cases per docket call. So when people interact with the justice system, it's normally in municipal courts. Most of us, it might be a speeding ticket. It's taken care of quickly. Maybe you call your attorney and deal with it. But reality in Clayton is that, and we learned is that about 90% of the people who are charged in the municipal court in Clayton are non-residents. And while we don't have exact data, our sense is that most of the people who are defendants on charges in the Clayton courts are what we might call the working poor. Okay, these are people who often have inability or difficulty paying fines. Okay, the way the courts are set up is, my understanding is that the municipal courts are divisions of the circuit court. So up until the Ferguson incident, situation and protests in Ferguson following the death of Michael Brown, pretty much the municipalities controlled their courts. Okay, and generally they handle their own local matters, city ordinances, traffic matters, local matters. They are not criminal courts. Okay, so technically, the offenses don't carry jail time, and defendants don't have the right to an attorney, and they're not covered by the public defender system. However, as we learned following Ferguson, that many of the people who interact with the municipal courts, somehow they end up in jail, okay, even though they are not criminal courts. And often that happens through something called bench warrants and failure to appear. And we spent a lot of time discussing how that happens and the way Clayton has been trying to deal with that. But following Ferguson, two major things happened, okay, because we put a lot of focus on the abuses that were going on in the municipal courts, particularly in St. Louis County. First was a state statute that was passed. It's called Senate Bill number 5. It dealt more with the revenue aspects of municipal courts, that many of the courts, not Clayton, but other courts were using the municipal courts and the fine systems as a source of revenue rather than seeking compliance with their local laws. Okay. The second thing that happened was the Missouri Supreme Court, which has supervisory responsibility over all the courts, municipal courts, they issued minimum standards for all the municipal courts. Okay. Now, Clayton, is my understanding, and Ben could probably agree with this, they embrace these minimum standards as just the minimums, because Clayton has really tried to exceed those minimums. Okay. What we've been learning is that the courts want to get to a point of what are the best practices in a municipal court, where many of the people who are put into the court system are poor, working poor, and have financial issues that maybe can't pay the fines. Okay, and it's not my understanding, and we're going to delve into this deeper, but Clayton is trying to get to a point of what are the best practices in the municipal court. And quite frankly, there is no such thing that exists that we know of. So basically, I think we're kind of we're blazing the trail as to what ought to be the best practices. Okay, so that's where we are. The other thing we're talking about, and I'll turn it over to Ben, is that we're sort of in twilight zone right now with the pandemic. Okay, because everything is different. Constitutionally, all the courts are required to be open, but reality is the courts can't be open. You can't pack in a courtroom 300 people under these conditions. So they're doing a lot of their stuff on Zoom, and that presents other problems, but other opportunities. Okay, and we talked about those. So that's kind of where we are right now. And let me turn it over to Ben and turn it over to the rest of the commissions for any questions.
No, nothing further to add other than the impression I got is that Clayton Municipal Court is trying very hard to be top rate, top notch, and fair to everyone.
Thank you both. We are pretty close to our time boundary. I do see a couple additional comments in the chat. One is a question from Kathleen Gunn to this body as a whole. I think we should treat it as we would a public comment, that can the CEC review the city code for you beat your time limits, Stuart. I'm
very close.
Super impressed, to be honest. Review the city code for discriminatory ordinances, especially in the area of residential housing in 2021. I think that's a great question to leave us with. I would personally quite curious if, Donna, you've followed any of the work in Creve Coeur, where they had a small neighborhood of Black home owners that were similarly displaced, and have done some work to connect with those families and think about how to fold them into civic processes like this commission. I'm curious if there might be an opportunity to really invite participation into this body.
I have not had any personal contact. I know the story and the efforts made around what Dr. Venerable attempted to do in Creve Coeur, and I'd have to leave it at that.
What you said.
Well, I have reached my personal time boundary, so I'm going to have us adjourn a little bit early. I apologize for the intrusion this evening. It is the first night of Hanukkah, so there's only so much excitement that can be kept at bay.
Sorry.
And if you haven't found, David Diggs, who played Lafayette and Jefferson in Hamilton, has put out probably the season's best Hanukkah song. So go check that out. You'll be really happy that you did. Can I get a motion to adjourn our meeting?
I want to say first, thank you very much for inviting me.
We're so happy to have you here, and we hope everyone has happy holidays. It's been really a pretty impressive highlight of 2020 for this group to come together and meet. We've met pretty much every month since March. So it's nice to end the year with a chance to learn together, which I think was one of our first goals. So we really appreciate you both for taking the time.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you to you both.
Everybody.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks, Donna.
Thank you very much, Terry and Donna.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for putting this together.
All right, everybody have a great night.
Good night.
Bye.
Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Jonah.